Nós, estudantes de Relações Internacionais da PUC São Paulo e integrantes do Grupo de Estudos sobre Conflitos Internacionais, em parceria com o Democracy Now!, apresentaremos as notícias da semana.
A partir de agora, vincularemos com legendas em português os principais destaques internacionais.
From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
On this vote, the ayes are 50, the nays are 48. The nomination of Brett M. Kavanaugh of Maryland to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States is confirmed.
The Senate confirms Brett Kavanaugh as the 9th Supreme Court Justice. He's expected to tilt power to conservatives for decades to come. His confirmation comes despite several accusations of attempted rape and sexual assault. We'll get reaction and look at what's next.
We refuse to be intimidated by the mob of people that were coming after Republican members at their homes, in the halls. I couldn't be prouder of the Senate Republican Conference. Yeah, these things always blow over.
Now we take this anger and determination and we realize that today is going to send a depth charge through politics as we know it, and we go home, we vote, and we run for office.
We'll go to Washington, D.C. to speak with Code Pink's Medea Benjamin about protesters at the Capitol and with Rewire editor-in-chief Jody Jacobson. We'll also speak with feminist author Soraya Chemaly. Her new book, Rage Becomes Her, The Power of Women's Anger. Then fears are growing over the missing Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who Turkish officials say they believe was murdered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul last week. Khashoggi is a Washington Post columnist. He lives in the United States and is a critic of the Saudi regime.
He is gathering all power within his hand, and it would be much better for him to allow a breathing space for critic, for Saudi intellectuals, Saudi writers, Saudi media to debate the most important needed transformation going in the country.
We'll speak with Mehdi Hassan, columnist for The Intercept, who knows Khashoggi and has interviewed him. We'll also speak with Medea Benjamin, author of Kingdom of the Unjust, behind the U.S.-Saudi connection. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Brett Kavanaugh was sworn in Saturday as an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court just hours after the Senate voted to confirm him. The 53-year-old's lifetime appointment cements a right-wing majority on the court for the foreseeable future. The vote was 50 in favor, 48 against, and 1 present. Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski, who promised to buck her party and vote no on Kavanaugh, she voted present so that Republican Senator Steve Daines of Montana could attend his daughter's wedding without voting. Republican Senator Susan Collins of Maine, who was seen as a possible swing vote on Kavanaugh's confirmation, announced her support for the candidate Friday afternoon.
Despite the turbulent, bitter fights surrounding his nomination, my fervent hope is that Brett Kavanaugh will work to lessen the divisions in the Supreme Court so that we have far fewer 5-4 decisions, and so that public confidence in our judiciary and our highest court is restored. Mr. President, I will vote to confirm Judge Kavanaugh.
Kavanaugh's confirmation came under intense public scrutiny after 3 women accused him of sexual misconduct. He has denied the allegations made by Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, as well as 2 more accusers, Julie Swetnick and Kavanaugh's former Yale classmate, Debbie Ramirez, who said he exposed himself to her during a party. In a statement released Saturday, Ramirez said by their vote, the senators were, quote, deliberately ignoring Kavanaugh's behavior, adding, I feel like I'm right back at Yale, where half the room is laughing and looking the other way. This is how victims are isolated and silenced, Ramirez said. West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin was the only Democratic senator to vote in favor of Kavanaugh's confirmation. This is Manchin after declaring his support for Kavanaugh last Friday.
No, I'm very much concerned, basically, with the sexual abuse that people have had to endure, and very much concerned that we have to do something as a country. But I had to deal with the facts I had in front of me.
Senator, do you think that there's still a place in the Democratic Party for you after this?
I'm just a West Virginian. I'm just a good old West Virginia boy.
You're up for re-election.
Protests against Kavanaugh's confirmation raged in Washington, D.C. and across the country Saturday. Capitol Police arrested 164 demonstrators, including 150 at the U.S. Capitol building, and a handful of protesters who interrupted the Senate roll call vote. In New York City, protesters took to the streets just as Kavanaugh was confirmed. This is Zakiya Ansari of the Alliance for Quality Education.
This is bigger than Kavanaugh. I want to constantly say that. This is way bigger. As a black Muslim woman in society, I am clear that Kavanaugh will not only return Roe v. Wade, but many civil rights legislations that are impactful, many things that have been supportive of communities that look like me, he will overturn those as well. But what I also am clear is that as a black woman in society, knowing that the struggles that we've been up against, that we too can rise above this. We too can fight back.
We'll have more on the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court after headlines. The United Nations Climate Panel warns in a new report humanity has only a dozen years to mitigate climate change or face global catastrophe with severe droughts, floods, sea level rise, and extreme heat set to cause mass displacement and poverty. The landmark report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, warns dramatic action is needed over the next 12 years to hold global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, beyond which global crises could unfold at a rapid pace. The report comes as Governor Rick Scott has declared Florida a state of emergency, as forecasters predict Tropical Storm Michael could strengthen to become a major hurricane as it makes landfall late Wednesday. In Indonesia, the death toll from last month's massive earthquake and tsunami has risen to more than 1,900, with some 60,000 people displaced after an 18-foot wall of water swept miles into the island of Sulawesi. Authorities warn some 5,000 people remain missing, many of them likely swept out to sea or trapped amidst rubble that could take months or years to clear. In Haiti, at least 12 people died and nearly 200 were injured after a 5.9 magnitude earthquake struck Saturday evening in Haiti's northwest. Many of the injuries came as unsafe cinder block homes and structures collapsed on residents. In Brazil, far-right presidential candidate Jair Bolsonaro surged to first place in Sunday's general election, but will face an October 28th runoff election after narrowly missing an outright win. Bolsonaro claimed 46% of the vote. He'll face Workers' Party candidate Fernando Haddad, who won just under 30%. Bolsonaro had a history of making racist, misogynistic, and homophobic comments. He is a former army officer who's openly praised Brazil's military dictatorship of the late 1960s and has encouraged police to kill suspected drug dealers and once told a female lawmaker she was too ugly to rape. Ahead of the election, anti-Bolsonaro protesters rallied in Sao Paulo and in other cities Saturday proclaiming "Not him."
My son is transgender, and for his security, I am protesting. Bolsonaro is homophobic and incites violence against those who are not heterosexual.
Fears are growing over the fate of missing Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi after Turkish officials said they believe he was murdered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul last Tuesday. Khashoggi is a columnist for The Washington Post. He'd been living in self-imposed exile in the United States. He entered the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey, seeking a document he needed to get married. He's not been seen since. The Washington Post reports a Turkish investigation has revealed a group of about 15 Saudi men traveled to Istanbul to kill him as he visited the consulate. Saudi officials have denied the report and say they don't know Khashoggi's whereabouts. Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut tweeted Sunday, "If this is true, that the Saudis lured a U.S. resident into their consulate and murdered him, it should represent a fundamental break in our relationship with Saudi Arabia," he said. We'll have more on the story later in the broadcast. In Afghanistan, at least 54 people were killed across the country on Sunday on the 17th anniversary of the start of the U.S. invasion. The death toll in Afghanistan included at least 19 Afghan civilians. American and Afghan airstrikes have increased in recent months as the conflict shows no sign of slowing down and the Taliban remain undefeated. The United Nations says the number of civilians killed in Afghanistan reached a record high in the first half of the year, with some 1,700 deaths reported. In New York, protesters gathered Sunday to call for an end to the Afghan war, the longest war in U.S. history. This is Susan Schnall of Veterans for Peace.
It's about all the wars that the United States perpetrates on other countries, and the fact that what I have seen over the past 50 years is United States multinational corporations getting larger and larger and continuing to support an American military that feels it can change the governance of any country it wishes to in furtherance of the interests of the corporations.
In the Gaza Strip, Israeli forces shot dead 3 Palestinians and injured 126 Friday during weekly protests near Israel's separation barrier. Among the dead was a 12-year-old boy, Faris al-Sarsawi. Israeli gunfire has killed at least 195 Palestinians and has wounded some 18,000 since Palestinians' Great March of Return protests began March 30th. In the West Bank, Israeli police say a 23-year-old Palestinian man shot and killed 2 Israelis and injured a 3rd person at an industrial park near an Israeli settlement Sunday. Meanwhile, the wife of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu appeared in a Jerusalem courtroom Sunday, facing trial on charges of fraud and breach of trust. Sarah Netanyahu is accused of spending about $100,000 to hire celebrity chefs to prepare meals for the Netanyahus and their guests, even though the Prime Minister's residence has a full-time chef. The trial comes as prosecutors have recommended indictments against Prime Minister Netanyahu for accepting bribes and trading political favors for positive news coverage. In Bulgaria, police found the body of a 30-year-old journalist Saturday in the northern town of Rus after she disappeared shortly after reporting on alleged corruption by local authorities. Police say Victoria Marinova's body showed signs she'd been raped, bludgeoned to the head, and suffocated. She's the 3rd journalist murdered in the European Union over the past year. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says North Korea will let international inspectors into nuclear sites and missile testing facilities. Pompeo's comments came after he wrapped up talks with leader Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang on Sunday. In western Germany, more than 50,000 protesters converged on the Hambach Forest Saturday, demanding an end to the planned expansion of a neighboring open-pit coal mine, the largest in Europe. The protests came as a German court halted plans by the RWE energy company to clear-cut more of the forest to make way for expanded mining. The court says it needs more time to determine whether the plans violate European Union environmental laws, a decision that won't happen until at least 2020. Last month, police raided a protest encampment in the Hambach Forest, arresting dozens of activists who'd been living in tree houses. To see our report from the Hambach Forest, you can go to democracynow.org. In Chicago, a jury Friday found white police officer Jason Van Dyke guilty of second-degree murder for killing African-American teenager Laquan McDonald in 2014. Van Dyke was also found guilty on 16 counts of aggravated battery, 1 count for each of the 16 bullets he fired at McDonald. A key piece of evidence for prosecutors was a police dash cam video showing McDonald posed no threat, walking away from officers before Van Dyke fired at him, emptying an entire magazine from his handgun. Jason Van Dyke was the first Chicago cop to stand trial for an on-duty murder in 50 years. In Charlotte, North Carolina, NFL star Eric Reid, who helped spark league-wide protests in 2016 when he became the first player to kneel alongside Colin Kaepernick during the playing of the national anthem, took a knee ahead of his first game with the Carolina Panthers Sunday. Reid's protests against police brutality and racial injustice came after he spent the offseason as an unsigned free agent before he was finally picked up by the Panthers late last month. Both Reid and Kaepernick have filed grievances with the NFL, alleging owners conspired to deny them contracts over their protests. Kaepernick is still unsigned. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Hurricane Michael is the worst storm that the Florida Panhandle has ever seen, and one of the worst power storms to ever make landfall in the United States.
At least 2 people have died as Hurricane Michael batters the Florida Panhandle and Georgia. The storm was supercharged by warmer than usual water in the Gulf of Mexico. We'll go to the Florida Panhandle for the latest. Then we look at Malik Shahid Hussein, the owner of the limousine company at the center of Saturday's crash that killed 20 people in New York, one of the worst transportation disasters in a decade in the U.S. Hussein is a former FBI informant who repeatedly entrapped Muslim men, landing many of them in jail. We'll speak with a number of people who knew Hussein, including a Pittsburgh man who was entrapped by him and just got out of jail.
Anything that he touches, anything that he's involved in, comes to ruin. This guy is a criminal. He's a liar. He's a thief. He's a con artist.
Plus, we'll speak with Yale professor Jason Stanley on his new book, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. At least 2 people have died in the U.S. after Hurricane Michael slammed into Florida and Georgia Wednesday as a Category 4 storm nearing Category 5. With winds topping 155 miles per hour, Michael is the 3rd most powerful storm to ever hit the U.S. mainland. The Carolinas are now bracing for more flooding just weeks after the region was devastated by Hurricane Florence. While meteorologists say Hurricane Michael was supercharged from the warmer-than-usual water in the Gulf of Mexico, there was almost no mention of global warming on the cable news networks. Advocacy groups say the Florida Department of Corrections has not evacuated at least a dozen prisons and mandatory evacuation zones as of Wednesday. This comes as, in Spain, torrential rains and flash flooding have killed at least 10 people on the island of Majorca. 9 inches of rain fell in just 2 hours in what meteorologists are calling a 1 in 1,000 years weather event. Meanwhile, in Indonesia, a 6.0 magnitude earthquake shook the islands of East Java and Bali early this morning, killing at least 3 people. This comes as the official death toll from the devastating 7.5 magnitude earthquake and tsunami in Indonesia 2 weeks ago has risen to over 2,000 dead, with over 5,000 people still missing. A new United Nations report says the damages caused by extreme weather events and other so-called natural disasters have cost $2.9 trillion in economic losses over the last 20 years. This is Professor Debarathi Guha, who is a contributor to the report.
We really need to have some disaster risk reduction and disaster risk mitigation, that is adaptation for the short term. For 5 to 10 year period, poor people in poor countries do not have 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. Most of those children will be dead. This is what is going to happen. Either they will be dead because of the catastrophe itself, or they'll be dead because of the prevailing persistent effect of malnutrition that comes along with these catastrophes.
This follows Monday's report by the Nobel Peace Prize-winning United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which found humanity has only a dozen years to mitigate global warming and limit the scope of global catastrophe. We'll have more on climate change and Hurricane Michael after headlines. The Washington Post is reporting, based on U.S. intelligence intercepts, that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, ordered an operation to lure Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi, in Arabic Jamal Khashoggi, back to Saudi Arabia from his home in Virginia. Khashoggi disappeared last week after entering the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. One Turkish official told the New York Times Khashoggi was assassinated inside the consulate by a team of 15 Saudi operatives who used a bone saw to dismember his body before smuggling body parts out of the building. The U.S. intelligence intercepts are the latest piece of evidence implicating the Saudi government directly in Khashoggi's death, which has sparked a diplomatic crisis for the Trump administration, particularly for President Trump and his son-in-law, senior advisor Jared Kushner. Kushner has actively cultivated Mohammed bin Salman as a key ally, praising the young leader, dining with him in Washington and Riyadh, and hosting one-on-one phone calls with him outside of normal diplomatic channels. On Wednesday, President Trump also praised Mohammed bin Salman, calling him a fine man, as Trump answered reporters' questions about who within the Saudi government he'd spoken to about Khashoggi's disappearance.
I'd rather not say, but at a very high level, the highest level. Let me say this, it's the highest level, okay? Yeah.
You mentioned that you talked to
more than once.
You had mentioned that you spoke to King Salman, so, I mean...
Well, I do anyway, and I've always found him to be a fine man. We've had a very good relationship. I'm not happy about this. We have to see what happens, you know. We have to see what happens. Nobody knows what happened yet. They don't know over there, but it's a very serious situation, and it's something we're taking very seriously.
In Brazil, thousands of people took to the streets of Sao Paulo to protest against far right-wing presidential candidate Jair Bolsonaro, who won first place in Sunday's presidential election, but will face a runoff against the second-place candidate, Fernando Haddad of the leftist Workers' Party, on October 28th. These are two of the protesters in Sao Paulo.
We have the fascist threat that is Bolsonaro, and we have to position ourselves.
I am very scared that there's a chance that Bolsonaro will become president. Our mission is to make no our answer, and I think we have 18 days to do it and try to solve this situation.
Wednesday's protests came as the Wall Street Journal endorsed Bolsonaro, despite his long history of making racist, homophobic, and misogynistic comments, as well as openly praising Brazil's military dictatorship. Using language that mirrored President Trump's campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again," the Wall Street Journal's editorial board wrote, quote, "Bolsonaro is best understood as a conservative populist who promises to make Brazil great for the first time. He's attracted support from the middle class by pledging to reduce corruption, crack down on Brazil's rampant crime, and liberate entrepreneurs from government control." At least 8 people died and another 25 are missing after a boat carrying refugees capsized off the coast of Turkey. The United Nations says over 1,700 refugees have died trying to cross the Mediterranean so far this year. Meanwhile, Moroccan Navy officers opened fire on a boat carrying Moroccan refugees towards Europe, injuring a 16-year-old boy. Last month, the Moroccan Navy opened fire on another refugee boat, killing a 20-year-old Moroccan woman. In Burma, authorities have arrested 3 journalists after they wrote a piece criticizing the government. The journalist from 11 Media Group, who wrote about the funding of a city bus system, could face up to 2 years in prison if found guilty of, quote, fear or alarm to the public, unquote. In 2016, editors from the same paper went to jail over a piece accusing a government official of bribery. The arrests come just a month after a Burmese court sentenced 2 Reuters journalists to 7 years in prison for violating Burma's colonial-era Official Secrets Act, causing international condemnation. At the time of their arrest, the Reuters journalists, Jo So-woo and Wa Lon, were investigating a massacre committed by the Burmese military targeting Rohingya Muslims. In Peru, Keiko Fujimori, the leader of the opposition and daughter of former dictator President Alberto Fujimori, was arrested Wednesday over allegations of money laundering and accepting illegal campaign contributions. Last week, a Peruvian judge overturned a pardon of her father, Alberto Fujimori, who's now expected to return to prison for crimes including kidnapping, bribery, and ordering massacres by death squads in the 1990s during his presidential rule. In financial news, the Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged by more than 800 points Wednesday as stocks of tech companies Facebook, Netflix, and Twitter all tumbled sharply. Economists say the market drop was sparked by the Fed's decision to raise interest rates after having propped up the economy for years following the 2008 economic crisis by holding interest rates at near zero levels. In more financial news, the Justice Department has approved a $69 billion merger between CVS Health and Aetna, one of the nation's largest healthcare insurance companies. The proposed merger is part of a wave of consolidation in the healthcare market, which experts say could leave patients with less control over their medical care and prescription drugs. In Canada, an Enbridge gas pipeline ruptured, sparking a massive fire and forcing about 100 members of the Ledley-Tenef First Nation to evacuate their homes in British Columbia. Enbridge is behind a series of controversial pipelines, including the Line 3 oil pipeline, which would carry tar sands oil from Alberta, Canada, to a terminal in Superior, Wisconsin, and whose proposed construction has sparked massive resistance from Indigenous communities on both sides of the U.S.-Canada border. At the U.S.-Mexico border, the family of Jose Antonio Rodriguez marched Wednesday to mark 6 years since the 16-year-old Mexican boy was fatally shot in the head by a U.S. Border Patrol agent who fired through the border fence and killed the teenager as he was walking on a sidewalk in Nogales, Mexico. This is his mother, Araceli Rodriguez.
Mi nombre es Araceli Rodriguez, mamá de José Antonio.
My name is Araceli Rodriguez, the mother of Jose Antonio. We're here because today marks 6 years since they assassinated my son. We're marching and we're demanding justice. That's why we're here, because we're demanding justice. Since 6 years after the assassination of my son, there is still no justice.
In Kazakhstan, 2 astronauts from the U.S. and Russia safely made an emergency landing this morning after the failure of a booster rocket as they were headed to the International Space Station. And activists turned the website brettKavanaugh.com into a resource for survivors of sexual assault. The site, whose URL was secured by a judicial reform group back in 2015, now shows a picture of the Supreme Court overlaid with the words, "We believe survivors," followed by a list of organizations seeking to end rape and sexual violence. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
Nosso programa fica por aqui. Você pode acompanhar a gente pela página no Facebook ou pelo blog Terra em Transe.
Nos vemos na próxima semana. Até lá!